The turbulence outside was nothing compared to what was brewing in the cabin. "Get out of first class," the flight attendant barked, her voice slicing through the hum of the aircraft. Passengers turned, some with confusion, others with smirks. Marcus Reynolds, a 60-year-old black man in a tailored Navy suit, sat in seat 2A, ticket paid in full ID, verified boarding pass scanned. None of it mattered. Not to her, not to them. The stewardess shoved his shoulder, rattling his seatbelt. "This seat's taken," she snapped, yanking the boarding pass from his lap without so much as a glance. A red-faced man across the aisle pointed with theatrical flair. "That's my seat," he barked to his phone's live stream, while hundreds of viewers watched the drama unfold. Another crew member appeared, eyes narrowed. "Threat in 2A, he typed into his crew app. The cabin tensed, gasps spread like fire through dry brush. Someone whispered, "Is he dangerous?" No evidence, no context. Just the color of his skin and the confidence he carried. Marcus didn't shout, he didn't resist. He simply stared ahead, jaw clenched, heart steady. If you believe in justice, hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories that expose the truth. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was pressure, thick, suffocating, and laced with judgment. Marcus Reynolds sat motionless in seat 2A, the warmth from the stewardess's shove still lingering on his shoulder. The plane hadn't yet left the tarmac, but the real turbulence had already taken off. Around him, eyes flicked his way, some pretending not to look, others brazen in their disdain. A few passengers clutched their champagne glasses a little tighter, as if his very presence might contaminate the bubbles. No one said a word. Not one of them. Not the man in 1C who'd just taken a business call boasting about a hedge fund merger. Not the woman in 2C who'd smiled politely during boarding but now refused to meet his eyes. Not the young man across the aisle live streaming the moment like a piece of theater. They all watched but no one intervened. In this cabin, silence was complicity. Marcus adjusted the cuffs of his shirt with deliberate calm. His silver cufflinks caught the overhead light, a quiet reminder that he wasn't some intruder or imposter. He had earned that seat not through privilege handed down, but through decades of resilience, sweat, and leadership. But in that moment, it didn't matter. His resume wasn't visible. His dignity wasn't measurable. His presence to them was a problem. Threat in 2A. That lie hung in the air like toxic smoke. The younger flight attendant, Ryan, had said it with such calculated cool that some passengers didn't even flinch. Others, however, shifted uneasily. A few heads turned to stare at him, not with concern, but with caution. The kind of caution reserved for those society had trained them to fear. And Marcus, despite every urge in his body to correct the record, remained silent. He knew better. He'd seen this before. In conference rooms where his ideas were questioned more than others. In elevator rides where security asked if he was looking for someone. In first-class lounges where he was offered directions to economy. Always the same dance: dignity versus assumption. Respect earned versus bias unshaken. Vicky Larson, the lead flight attendant, stood with her arms crossed like a warden waiting to cage a problem. "Sir, you've been asked to move," she repeated, her tone sharper this time. But Marcus didn't budge. His grip on the armrest remained steady. No sudden movements, no raised voice, just steady, stone-cold calm. Then came Preston Tate, loud and full of himself, standing in the aisle like a bad actor in a courtroom drama. "You don't belong here," he barked, his camera still rolling. The live stream scrolled rapidly with comments, some mocking, others concerned. But the overwhelming tone was spectacle. This wasn't a man in distress to them. This was content. Viral bait. Marcus turned his head slightly, eyes locking with Preston's. "Your actions will bury you," he said in a voice so even it chilled the air. It wasn't a threat, it was a prophecy. Preston sneered, oblivious to the weight of those words. Suddenly, Vicky lunged forward, snatching the torn boarding pass from Marcus' lap and tossing it toward Ryan. "Economy is where you belong," she muttered under her breath. It was meant to be quiet. It wasn't. Several passengers heard it, and several recorded it. Marcus felt a tremor pass through him, not of fear, but of deep, simmering disappointment. He wasn't surprised. He was used to people like her, like them. But the wound still opened. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about erasure. About being told yet again that success status and security weren't shields strong enough to protect a black man from prejudice. Behind him, row 5 stirred. A woman shifted in her seat. A man leaned forward. They were watching too. Some with discomfort, others with disbelief. Still no one spoke, not even when Ryan tapped his app again and flagged Marcus as a level 2 disruption. It was all happening so smoothly, so professionally, as if discrimination had been integrated into company protocol, just another feature of the flight experience. And Marcus knew this wasn't new. It was rehearsed. Quiet bigotry disguised as procedure. Microaggressions executed with a smile. He had a choice: stand and escalate, or stay seated and endure. He chose the latter, not because he was afraid, but because he was calculating. Every camera phone now filming him was a weapon. Every whispered insult a line of future testimony. Every moment he stayed silent was a moment the world would have to reckon with when the truth surfaced. And it would. Not now, but soon. Just then the cabin lights flickered again. The turbulence outside was beginning to rattle the fuselage. A metaphor perhaps for what was coming inside. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. He inhaled once. Deep. Measured. This wasn't humiliation, not truly. This was the beginning of the record. And history he knew would side with the man who didn't flinch. Beneath Marcus Reynolds' stillness was not surrender, it was control. Every calculated breath he took, every pause before replying, wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Vicky Larson didn't know that, neither did Ryan Kessler. And certainly not Preston Tate, who was too busy performing for his dwindling TikTok audience to recognize what Marcus represented. To them, he was just another passenger who'd wandered into privilege by mistake. But Marcus had built his life on proving people like them wrong. They didn't know he held multiple degrees, one in aeronautical engineering from Georgia Tech and another in law from Harvard. They didn't know he'd once prosecuted aviation discrimination cases for the Department of Justice before launching SkyPulse Solutions, the cybersecurity firm that now safeguarded over 60% of all airline systems in North America. He'd spent his life understanding flight paths, not just of airplanes, but of institutions, power and prejudice. And he knew turbulence when he saw it coming. 2 years earlier, Marcus had offered Horizon Airlines a partnership predictive software to detect bias in customer service patterns using live data. Horizon declined. Too intrusive, they'd said. Too complicated, others had echoed. But Marcus had heard the subtext clearly. Too threatening. Just like now. Sitting in seat 2A, quietly branded a threat, Marcus smiled to himself bitterly. He had warned Horizon this was coming. They had chosen ignorance. And now their ignorance was trending. What none of the staff realized, not Vicky, not Ryan, not even the smug CEO watching this debacle from a corner office, was that Marcus never flew unprepared. His watch, seemingly an expensive fashion piece, was equipped with a hidden micro camera. His boarding pass had a smart chip. His digital wallet logged all interactions with Horizon's app, including Ryan's crew app entry, labeling him a threat. Everything was being recorded. But Marcus wasn't the only one documenting the injustice. 3 rows back sat Jada Holmes. She wore dark glasses and a fitted leather jacket, looking like a passenger on a short business trip. But she wasn't just anyone. She was SkyPulse's director of field response, a cyber ethics specialist with a background in covert digital surveillance. Jada was already filming. Her phone, discreetly propped against the seat in front of her, streamed the incident to a private server. To her left, Evan Ruiz, a journalist and longtime friend of Marcus, typed rapidly on his tablet. His YouTube channel had over 800,000 subscribers, and he knew how to tell a story. But this wasn't a story he had expected to tell today. He thought he was tagging along for a quiet weekend conference. Now he was documenting a case of racial profiling in real time. And then in seat 23B sat Nia Foster, Marcus's longtime legal strategist. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes missed nothing. She had spent 15 years building a case against another airline for discriminatory seat reassignments and had won. She knew what evidence looked like. In this flight, it was overflowing with it. Further back in Coach Laya Patel, an influencer with a strong following in the social justice space, clipped a mic to her tray table and quietly began recording the cabin audio. As Vicky muttered under her breath as Ryan falsely reported threats, as Preston live-streamed slurs disguised as sarcasm, Leia's setup caught it all crisp and unfiltered. But perhaps the most important camera was the one hidden inside the cockpit. Colin Drake, the flight's senior pilot, had been watching everything unfold via the plane's security feed. A seasoned aviator, Colin had flown through literal war zones, But what he witnessed on this flight disturbed him more than enemy fire. He had watched Marcus board, had seen the legitimate ticket, and now he was watching the staff treat him as a criminal without cause. Cullen quietly activated the cockpit's body cam system, a feature rarely used except in emergencies. And though no alarms had sounded, Cullen knew this was an emergency, not of engines or altitudes, but of ethics. Down below, as the plane soared above Pennsylvania, Marcus flexed his wrist, subtly zooming the watch lens toward Vicky. She was whispering to Ryan. Something about leaking Marcus's travel history. Something about letting the media spin his background. Marcus recorded it all. He wasn't worried about the smear. Not anymore. He had spent years building something impenetrable, not just a business, but a legacy. His name wasn't tied to controversy. It was tied to compliance, justice, and transformation. And today, everything Horizon Airlines had mocked, dismissed, and tried to erase was going to become their undoing. Then came the line. "No blacks in our first class," Vicky whispered, thinking the turbulence would mask her cruelty. It didn't. The microphone picked up every word. The digital clock on Marcus' watch froze that moment in high resolution. He didn't speak. He didn't stand. He simply looked forward, watching the storm outside while the real one erupted inside. He texted 2 words to Nia Leakett. The sky outside was darkening, but for Marcus Reynolds, a quiet light had already begun to break through. The rot within Horizon Airlines wasn't born that day. It had been marinating for years. What Marcus Reynolds experienced in Seat 2A wasn't the result of a rogue flight attendant or one ill-mannered passenger. It was the fruit of a diseased culture, a culture that had mastered how to mask bias with policy, how to disguise profiling behind phrases like standard protocol and passenger safety, and how to turn discrimination into a daily operational feature. Vicky Larson was just the surface of the problem. Her muttered slur, caught on multiple devices, didn't come from nowhere. It came from an ecosystem that allowed her to believe there would be no consequences. And why wouldn't she? For years, Horizon had quietly tolerated complaints, buried incidents, and paid settlements with airtight NDAs that gagged the truth before it could reach the public. Marcus knew this. He'd seen the signs long before stepping on this flight. In fact, Horizon Airlines was already under quiet scrutiny by several watchdog groups for opaque seating practices, unusually high ejection rates of minority passengers, and untraceable threat assessments made midair by crew using their internal apps. What the public didn't know, but Marcus did, was that Horizon's internal systems were designed not just to record data, but to weaponize it. That app Ryan tapped to flag him as a threat. It didn't just notify crew. It logged his profile location, behavioral risks, and relayed it to Horizon's central operations hub in real time. Their anonymous analysts, most of whom had no direct contact with passengers, could escalate, delete, or tag individuals without explanation. Marcus had spent years building tools to detect this kind of tech-enabled discrimination. He was one of the few people alive who could both recognize the code and trace it back to the system architects. And Horizon had just targeted the wrong man with the very tool he'd once tried to fix. Back in row 23B, Nia Foster scanned her phone as the text from Marcus came in. "Leak it," he had written. She didn't hesitate. From her secure cloud folder, she queued up a compressed folder containing prior whistleblower documents about Horizon's internal flagging system. Not only that, but attached was an internal memo leaked to her firm 6 months ago, one that described Horizon's passenger calibration initiative, a program that quietly trained staff to watch for passenger archetypes considered high risk. That list, it included older black males traveling solo, individuals in formal dress with strong posture, and those recording confrontations. The irony was staggering. Marcus ticked every box. But that wasn't the most damning part. The program's own language advised crew to use discretion and invoke security protocols to remove undesired passengers before takeoff to avoid post-flight litigation. It was essentially a script for lawful-looking profiling. Nia encrypted the documents and sent them to 2 recipients, Evan Ruiz, whose YouTube Live had already passed 10,000 viewers, and an anonymous source at ProPublica. Within minutes, Evan's screen lit up with the alert. He scanned the file names, eyes widening. Then, with a firm voice, he addressed his live stream. "We have received leaked documents suggesting Horizon's system wasn't just careless. It was calibrated. What you're seeing unfold isn't an isolated incident. It's design." The live chat exploded. Horizon Exposed began trending within 7 minutes. Inside the cockpit, Colin Drake's heart pounded as he saw the same notification pop on his backup screen sent by a passenger bypassing the airline's network. He read the first few lines and sat back stunned. The same system he'd trusted for over a decade had been quietly weaponized. He looked over at his co-pilot, who simply stared back wide-eyed. "Do we call this?" in his co-pilot asked. "No," Colin said, his voice heavy. "We document everything, and we make sure it's all handed over." Back in first class, the cabin crew tried to maintain the illusion of control, but the veneer was cracking. Ryan scrolled through the crew app only to find a flurry of internal alerts warning of system pings being traced. His confident smirk faltered. And Vicky. She paced near the galley, eyes darting as passengers began to whisper louder. Some had caught her slur on video. Others had downloaded the leaked documents now circling in group chats. Her power, the kind she had built on quiet compliance and fearful deference, was evaporating. Across the aisle, Preston Tate looked suddenly unsure. His TikTok live had taken a hard turn. The laughing comments had vanished, replaced by condemnation. "Delete this, bro. This is racial abuse. You're done." He didn't understand it fully, but even he could feel the shift. Marcus remained silent, still cuffed, still calm, still watching. But now his eyes weren't on Vicky. They were on the monitors, on the passengers, on the shift beginning to take place not just in perception, but in power. In seatback screens, Evan Ruiz's feed began playing. Passengers gasped as they saw phrases like passenger archetypes and preemptive escalation flashing before them. Someone muttered, "Is this real?" Another whispered. They trained them to do this, and in that moment for the first time, Marcus wasn't alone. The systemic rot had been exposed, and now the system was beginning to smell. When the first murmurs began, they were barely audible, no more than shifting discomfort. But discomfort, when amplified by truth, becomes awakening. And row by row, passenger by passenger, something began to change in that cabin. In seat 4B, an older white man named Douglas Hatch had been watching Marcus since the moment he boarded. Douglas wasn't a bigot, or so he thought. He was a retired investment banker, used to luxury, used to being listened to, used to quietly dismissing what he didn't understand. When Vicky barked at Marcus, he said nothing. When Ryan flagged him as a threat, he furrowed his brow, but shrugged. He had told himself it wasn't his fight. But when the video began playing on the seatback screen in front of him, the leaked Horizon training manual, the targeting of specific racial profiles, Douglas froze. The page was clear, too clear. The words "black males over 50 traveling alone" screamed from the screen like an indictment. His face went pale. He turned slowly, looking at Marcus, and for the first time he didn't see a disruption. He saw a mirror, a man of stature, experience, restraint, a man who could have easily been him except for the color of his skin. The thought hit him like a blow to the chest. Douglas leaned forward and tapped the shoulder of the woman in 3B. "Did you see this?" he whispered. "I'm watching it now," she replied, eyes wide. I think we all owe him an apology." 2 rows back, Laya Patel's fingers trembled slightly as she finished uploading another clip to her Instagram story. It wasn't just footage, now it was testimony. Passengers, whispering faces, shifting from skepticism to shame, the slow collapse of the cabin's confidence and authority. She had covered protest marches and policy battles across the country, but she had never seen transformation unfold in real time like this. Not in the air. Her mic was still live, her followers now in the hundreds of thousands. The hashtag Justice for Marcus was gaining traction not just among social activists, but among pilots, gate agents, and even airline union reps. She saw a comment pop up. "My dad flies for Horizon, he just quit." In row 8C, a teenage girl nudged her mother. "Mom, why didn't anyone stop them?" The mother hesitated, then whispered, "Because we were afraid to speak up, but I'm not anymore." Not everyone found clarity so quickly. Vicky Larson stood frozen near the galley, the color draining from her face as she watched the ripple begin. Her training hadn't prepared her for this. She'd been taught how to de-escalate drunk passengers, how to detect security threats, how to maintain first-class decorum. But nothing in her manual prepared her for a mass awakening of bystanders who were no longer willing to stay silent. She saw a young woman in 5D pointing her phone directly at her and whispering into her camera, "This is the woman who said, 'No blacks in first class.'" The bile rose in her throat. The line she had spoken so casually, so privately, assuming the storm outside would drown it, was now echoing across screens worldwide. Further down, Evan Ruiz scanned the live chat on his tablet. Messages poured in faster than he could read them. This could have been my dad, watching from Johannesburg. We see you, Marcus. Do not let Horizon bury this. And then came a direct message from a name he didn't expect, Captain Angela Keene, a 22-year Horizon veteran. Her message was simple: watching. I've seen this before. I'm ready to speak. Evan's pulse quickened. Even in the cockpit, the transformation was beginning. Colin Drake turned to his co-pilot Mark, who had been silently watching the events unfold via their secondary screen. Mark was 20 years younger, usually quick to brush off drama. But not today. They're going to burn for this, huh? Mark whispered. No, Colin replied quietly. They're going to change, or we burn too. He tapped his headset mic. Cabin control, this is the cockpit. A formal statement is being prepared. We're contacting the FAA. Ryan, hearing the transmission, spun toward the galley panel. What the hell is he doing? He hissed. But Elaine Carver, the senior cabin director, had gone pale. Her earlier whispers about Marcus's background, her comments about leaking his travel history, they were already being dissected online thanks to Colin's quiet audio capture. Elaine stepped back, her authority slipping. For the first time since takeoff, she looked uncertain. Not afraid of Marcus, but afraid of the people around her. The passengers, the crew, the witnesses who were waking up one by one. Marcus sat upright, still restrained, but his eyes were no longer fixed on the injustice. They were locked on the shift. He watched Douglas stand and address the cabin. This man belongs here, Douglas said, voice shaking, and we should all be ashamed that it took a screen to convince us. A hush fell, then clapping, then a ripple of agreement words like, release him, let him go, this is wrong. And in that moment, something fundamental broke open. The culture of compliance was collapsing, and the witnesses, they were finally awake. Marcus Reynolds didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to beg or explain or defend. The cameras were already doing the work. But now that the truth had cracked through the cabin's silence, he began assembling something stronger than outrage. He began building the case. From his seat in the galley, still cuffed and bruised where Preston's elbow had landed, Marcus flexed his left wrist slowly. With one subtle motion, he activated the encrypted data relay embedded in his watch band. The micro camera had already captured everything: Vicky's slur, Ryan's threat tag, Elaine's whisper about leaking Marcus's background, and Preston's assault. Now the files were being offloaded in real time to a secure server managed by Sky Pulse Solutions. 3,000 feet above Pennsylvania, while the plane shook with a combination of turbulence and tension, the first drops of legal thunder were already falling. In seat 23B, Nia Foster received the signal. Her laptop pinged. The stream of footage synced to her device backup files, duplicated and encrypted again. She checked her email. A message had arrived from Colin Drake, the pilot. Subject line: cabin recordings. Attached was cockpit audio from the last hour, including Elaine's quiet declaration. Older black men threaten the brand. Nia's fingers flew across the keyboard. She pulled in additional context: time-stamped crew chat logs, Preston's TikTok live stream already flagged, but screen recorded, and even the moment Ryan typed threat in 2A into his device. This wasn't just emotional, it was airtight, layered, documented. Evan Ruiz, seated 2 rows ahead, was still broadcasting. But now his focus shifted. With his voice steady and professional, he laid out a timeline. 8:11 a.m. Marcus boarded with a valid ticket. 8:17 a.m. Vicky challenged his presence, claiming his seat was taken. 8:19 a.m. Ryan logged a false threat report using Horizon's app. 8:26 a.m. Preston began live streaming and physically shoved Marcus. 8:31 a.m. Vicky whispered the racial slur caught on multiple devices. 8:43 a.m. Elaine discussed media manipulation of Marcus's image. By 8:56 a.m. Colin Drake activated cockpit body cam and notified Nia. It wasn't just footage, it was a coordinated response, a paper trail of misconduct. Jada Holmes, still seated with her phone now synced to the cabin's PA system, used her cybersecurity background to tap into Horizon's internal control panel. It wasn't hacking, it was technical literacy. Horizon's in-flight system used a dated interface. With a simple override, she mirrored the evidence directly onto seatback screens again. A split screen showed Preston's live stream on one side and the internal Horizon manual on the other. The caption read, "This is what systemic profiling looks like in real time." Phones came out again. Even those who had tried to ignore it were now forced to confront it, watching footage of Marcus calmly asserting his rights while being lied about, assaulted, and restrained. Ryan, realizing what was happening, lunged toward the panel to disconnect the feed. "Don't even think about it," said a voice behind him. It was Douglas Hatch, the man in 4B who'd once said nothing. Now he stood between Ryan and the panel, holding his phone up. "You've done enough." Ryan hesitated. His face, once smug, now twitched with something close to fear. Meanwhile, back in coach, a group of passengers formed a quiet chain. Devices were passed forward. Screens showed downloads in progress. Evan's live stream, Naya's legal docs, Jada's forensic dashboard. They were archiving everything. From the overhead bins to the final row, an impromptu data net had formed. One woman, a mother traveling with her daughter, whispered to the child, "See this? This is how you fight without shouting." In the cockpit, Colin placed a call. "FAA enforcement. This is Captain Colin Drake. I'm declaring a documentation protocol. I have evidence of systemic abuse, and I'm requesting secured handoff upon landing." He paused. "Yes, I know what I'm doing." On the ground, air traffic control was already rerouting the flight, not to its original destination, but to a smaller federally monitored airstrip in Scranton, Pennsylvania, where legal oversight would be present. Colin looked out the window, watching the clouds begin to break. The storm outside was clearing. The one inside had just begun. Elaine, pacing furiously at the front of the plane, received a message on her headset from Horizon HQ. Her face turned gray. "They're watching," she whispered. She turned to Ryan. "We need to delete the logs. All of them." But as she reached for the master reset tab on her crew tablet, her fingers froze. The screen blinked with a new message: "Data integrity locked by passenger override audit. Trail secured." Courtesy of Jada Holmes. They were cornered. In the galley, Marcus shifted in his seat, finally speaking into the silence. "You've written the story yourselves. All I did was press record." It was no longer just about proving injustice. It was about leaving a record no one could erase. The power had officially shifted, and for the first time in Horizon's history, it didn't sit with the uniforms or the company's PR playbook. It sat with the truth, carefully recorded, encrypted, and now echoing through every aisle, seatback, and smartphone on board. Marcus Reynolds was no longer just a passenger. He was a strategist orchestrating a silent rebellion from within a metal capsule 30,000 feet in the air. And now the retaliation wasn't loud. It was surgical. First came the redirect. Naya Foster, seeing the incoming threat from Horizon's legal department, likely scrambling to issue denials and initiate counter-narratives, locked down the cloud drive, storing Marcus's footage. She routed access through 3 backup servers, one in Geneva, one in Toronto, and a military-grade zero-trust node in Washington, D.C. If Horizon tried to scrub evidence, they would find themselves facing 3 layers of international jurisdiction. This wasn't just about exposure, it was about digital permanence. Then Jada Holmes activated SkyPulse's emergency protocol, Flight Fortress. It was a security feature buried in a private suite of software tools built specifically for whistleblower protection. It automatically pinged Horizon's executive servers with a legal compliance notice, informing them that any deletion of data related to Marcus Reynolds or the incident aboard Flight 227 would be treated as tampering with federal evidence. Across the aisle, Evan Ruiz sat back in his seat and hit publish on a prepared story. It wasn't his usual headline. It was a legal primer titled "What to Do If You Witness In-Flight Discrimination." The article cited current FAA guidelines, Department of Transportation protocols, and even referenced Marcus' original legal contributions from years earlier. Within 10 minutes, the article had been shared 40,000 times. Meanwhile, Marcus, still seated and cuffed, began sending coordinated texts through his secured smartwatch. Each message carried a single directive, simple but powerful. To his media team, engage. To his legal team, preserve. To his tech division, monitor. To a private contact at the Department of Justice, confirm packet received. They had. While most of the cabin believed Marcus was still a restrained victim behind the scenes, he was moving pieces, activating systems, engaging alliances, and preparing for a counterattack unlike anything Horizon had ever seen. In the cockpit, Captain Colin Drake received an encrypted message routed through FAA enforcement, confirmed diversion to Scranton Regional Airfield. DOJ observers en route. Colin nodded grimly and flipped the intercom switch. Ladies and gentlemen, he said calmly, we are diverting for passenger safety protocol. Estimated time to ground 23 minutes. Gasps rippled through the plane. The quiet hum of jet engines now underscored something else entirely, a building reckoning. Elaine Carver, pale and pacing, whispered into her headset again. They're diverting. We're going to be met. Ryan Kessler tried to sound confident, but his voice cracked. Let's just tell them it was a misunderstanding. Miscommunication. Standard procedure. But Vicky had already crumbled. Her hands trembled as she clutched a printout from the Horizon manual, one she didn't know Jada had beamed directly to her tablet. The line flagged non-conforming passengers who disrupt standard perceptions of class seating sat highlighted in yellow. She whispered to no one in particular, I didn't know they meant him. In economy, passengers were no longer whispering. They were discussing, strategizing. A woman who identified herself as a retired civil rights attorney offered to represent any other passengers willing to sign an affidavit as witnesses. She passed out business cards torn from her carry-on. A young man opened his laptop and began building a web page titled flight227truth.com. Another passenger, a software engineer, set up a blockchain timestamp registry for all files and media shared during the incident, ensuring Horizon couldn't claim any were altered post-flight. It was a digital revolution unfolding row by row. Marcus's strategy wasn't to fight fire with fire. It was to fight structure with structure. Every action from this point forward was deliberate. When Ryan tried to disable Marcus's Wi-Fi again, a message flashed, system override locked by OT witness protocol. Jada had tied the in-flight system to a live regulatory monitor. When Elaine attempted to wipe the crew logs via her master panel, a second notification popped, tampering detected. Audit notification sent. When Preston tried to delete his TikTok stream, the app blocked him. Meta's automated content integrity team had already flagged the video for evidence retention. Preston's face mid-punch, mid-smirk was frozen across thousands of screens. The chain of retaliation Horizon had quietly relied on for years, smear silence erasure, was broken. Now they were the ones being watched. Back in the galley, Marcus looked out the window. The clouds were beginning to part. Below, a stretch of runway waited, flanked by emergency vehicles, press vans, and black SUVs from the Department of Transportation. He leaned slightly toward the camera still embedded in his cufflink and said, make sure the landing's recorded too. Because his strategy wasn't just about reclaiming his dignity. It was about rewriting the flight manual for the entire nation. The wheels hit the runway with a screech that echoed like a gavel in a courtroom. Horizon Flight 227 had landed, but not in triumph. It was a descent into reckoning. On the tarmac of Scranton Regional Airfield, law enforcement vehicles lined the perimeter, their lights muted but unmistakable. In a van parked beside the terminal, a Department of Transportation liaison waited, flanked by FAA observers and DOJ compliance officers. Inside the aircraft, the cabin had become a pressurized crucible of truth and fear. As the aircraft taxied toward the emergency gate, Marcus Reynolds sat calmly in the galley, wrists still cuffed, but posture regal. He had said almost nothing in the last 20 minutes, and yet every move happening outside the armed presence, the redirected air traffic, the media frenzy, was orbiting around his silence. But now the silence was ending. The seatbelt sign blinked off. The moment the plane came to a full stop, Colin Drake emerged from the cockpit and stepped into the aisle, something he had never done mid-incident in over 2 decades of flying. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, voice steady, you are all witnesses to an event currently under federal review. I advise you not to delete any footage. You have the right to retain your digital evidence. Any attempt by a crew to confiscate your property is a violation of FAA regulations. Gasps. A stunned hush. Vicky Larson looked like she'd been slapped. Elaine Carver's jaw clenched so tightly her headset cord trembled. Ryan turned pale, sinking into a jump seat, his arrogance replaced with sweat and silence. Marcus lifted his chin. It was time. The galley door opened slowly as 2 federal agents stepped on board, suited badges visible, expressions unreadable. They approached Ryan first. Mr. Kessler, one of them said, we'll be speaking with you shortly. Then Vicky. Ma'am, we're requesting your device. A court order for data preservation has been issued under the Transportation Equity and Passenger Protection Act. Elaine tried to intervene, but a third agent stepped forward and handed her a printed directive. Cabin Director Carver, you are temporarily relieved of supervisory duty pending investigation. Please remain seated and do not attempt to leave the aircraft. She sat, the weight of a collapsing system finally pinning her down. And then the agents approached Marcus. Mr. Reynolds, one of them, said gently, "We understand you've been unlawfully detained during this flight. Do you wish to file your formal complaint at this time?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked up just as dozens of passengers raised their phones. He turned slowly toward Preston Tate, who had been cowering in his seat near row 3, his blazer now wrinkled, his TikTok career in freefall. Preston tried to look away. Marcus spoke clearly for the cabin to hear Preston Tate. "Your live stream helped prove what your words tried to erase." Preston stammered, I didn't know." "No," Marcus interrupted. "You didn't want to know. There's a difference." Then Marcus turned toward Ryan. "You flagged me as a threat, with no provocation, no incident, just your perception." Ryan opened his mouth, but no sound came. Marcus continued. "You locked me out of Wi-Fi, deleted my name from the system, tried to erase my seat, my presence, my record. But you forgot the one truth your system wasn't built to delete. I am not afraid of you." The entire front cabin listened in silence. Finally, he turned to Vicky. Her lip quivered. "You told me no blacks in first class. You tried to say it under your breath, as if whispering it made it less real, as if the sound of an aircraft could muffle the sound of hate." Her mouth opened, but Marcus cut her off. "I don't want your apology. I want your accountability." He turned to the agents. "I'll press full charges." A ripple of shock swept the cabin, not because of his words, but because of how calmly they landed. There was no anger, no vengeance in his tone, just inevitability. Elaine tried one last time to salvage control. She stood. "This is being blown out of proportion," she insisted. "We're dealing with a high-profile instigator trying to create a media circus." Marcus looked at her unimpressed. "I wrote the guidelines you violated," he said, pulling a printed document from the pocket of his blazer. "The very laws you tried to dance around. I helped draft them when I was with the DOJ." Elaine froze. Colin, watching from the back, added, "I can confirm. He's not lying." With that, Marcus stepped forward, wrists still bound, and presented his hands to the federal agents. "Uncuff me," he said. They did. And as the metal fell away, it wasn't just steel that hit the floor. It was the illusion of impunity. Passengers began to stand. One by one, they offered nods, whispered thank you, some even clapped. But Marcus didn't smile. He turned to the rear of the plane where Naya, Jada, Evan, and Leia were already preparing external hard drives, briefing legal observers, and organizing the digital chain of custody for every piece of evidence. He walked down the aisle slowly, with purpose. Every step wasn't just a walk toward justice. It was a confrontation with a system that thought it could bury the truth. But Marcus Reynolds had carried the truth on board, and now it was coming for them. Outside the aircraft, the air buzzed with tension. Press vans lined the barricades. Horizon Airlines' PR team, hastily dispatched from headquarters, was arrived too late to intercept the unraveling. Federal agents swarmed the gate. The aircraft, now parked beneath a gray Pennsylvania sky, had become a floating courtroom, and its gallery of witnesses was more damning than any lawsuit Horizon had ever faced. Marcus Reynolds descended the jet bridge slowly, every step deliberate. Cameras flashed, phones pointed. DOJ officials flanked him not as guards but as escorts to truth. At the base of the bridge stood a representative from the Department of Transportation, holding a clipboard with one word stamped across the top in bold red letters: investigation. Inside the terminal, the fallout had already begun. Elaine Carver, still seated at the front of the plane, had been formally relieved. FAA agents read her rights in front of the remaining crew. Her headset, tablet, and badge were collected into a clear evidence bag. As she was escorted off the plane, one reporter shouted, "Do you deny the racial profiling claims?" She didn't answer, but her silence was recorded, and silence at this stage was guilt. Ryan Kessler tried to slip away through the service entrance, but a junior agent stopped him cold. "Mr. Kessler," she said calmly, "you're named in a federal complaint. You'll remain here until your statement is complete." His jaw twitched. He was no longer staff. He was suspect. Vicky Larson wept quietly in the galley. The bravado, the entitlement, it had all melted into disbelief. As the passenger manifest circulated online and the audio of her slur continued to trend, her name had become a lightning rod for outrage. HR had already sent her a termination notice via internal mail. The airline was trying to isolate the damage, but it was far too late. At Horizon's Manhattan headquarters, CEO Roger Hensley watched the chaos unfold from a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. His phone buzzed nonstop calls from shareholders, legal advisors, and board members. The stock had dropped another 22% in the last hour. Nearly $3 billion in valuation gone. A single flight had ruptured the brand's core, exposing what internal critics had whispered about for years. "Where is he now?" Roger barked. Landing, a PR director replied. "He's walking into the press pit with the DOJ. Sir, he's carrying the manual." "What manual?" Roger asked, already knowing the answer. "The bias training draft. The one legal buried." Roger didn't speak. He didn't blink. He simply turned toward the wall of monitors displaying live footage from Scranton. There stood Marcus, flanked by Jada Holmes and Evan Ruiz. He held a thick file in one hand and a flash drive in the other, and he was smiling. Outside microphones were thrust in his direction. "Mr. Reynolds," one reporter called, "do you plan to press charges?" "I already have," Marcus replied. "Do you believe this was an isolated incident?" He paused. What happened on that flight wasn't just personal, it was procedural. Horizon Airlines didn't just fail a passenger, it failed a principle. Equality at altitude, justice in transit. If they can erase one of us, they can erase all of us. The crowd fell silent. He held up the flash drive. "This contains video, audio, and metadata of everything that occurred. More importantly, it contains Horizon's internal protocols. Their manual, their design, their intent." Reporters jostled. One shouted, "What do you plan to do with it?" Marcus turned to the DOJ representative beside him. "Hand it over." And he did. Behind the scenes, Nia Foster was already in motion. She had filed a full class action suit representing not just Marcus, but passengers on board, former employees, and those who had faced similar treatment over the years. With documentation, sworn statements, and whistleblower protections now engaged, the case wasn't just strong, it was bulletproof. Horizon scrambled. Internal emails leaked, showing frantic attempts to disable systems, erase logs, and reassign blame. But it was no use. Jada had anticipated every move. She had intercepted packets of deleted server data and mirrored them to government watchdog groups. Within 24 hours, Horizon Airlines was named in a federal civil rights lawsuit, a Department of Transportation audit, and a Congressional Oversight Committee inquiry. The FAA announced an emergency review of all crew evaluation systems across major carriers. By the next morning, Horizon Exposed had been viewed over 150 million times. Investors pulled out. Unions called for new training mandates. Flight crews at competing airlines posted solidarity statements, and consumer watchdogs issued travel advisories. In a quiet office outside Washington, a federal magistrate reviewed the evidence Marcus had delivered. The images, the voices, the timestamps, the leaked policy excerpts. It was undeniable. A warrant was signed to seize Horizon's internal database. The company's legal shield had collapsed. Back in New York, Roger Hensley faced his board. "We need to settle." "We tried," one director replied. "They're not negotiating." "Then buy silence," Roger snapped. Another director shook his head. "Sir, Marcus doesn't want silence." He looked up. He wants transformation. And transformation was already underway. Marcus wasn't suing to be made whole. He was suing to break the mold. Because systems don't collapse by accident. They collapse when the truth is too heavy to hold. Bankommun vittip von tip tao không bono. Bandanai yes, ChatGPT danai part 2. Rebirth moment, 150 words. By the end of the week, Horizon Airlines no longer resembled itself. Gone were the glossy marketing campaigns touting first-class fairness. Gone were the LinkedIn posts boasting about inclusion and innovation. The airline's social media accounts had gone dark. Comment sections were flooded with screenshots, videos, and reposts of Marcus Reynolds' silent defiance, of Vicky Larson's hateful whisper, of Ryan Kessler's smug attempt to erase a man. But even more profound than the destruction was what came next, the beginning of something new. Marcus didn't vanish into legal proceedings. He didn't sit back and let the courts do the work. He showed up. On day 3 after the landing, he stood before a packed room at the National Press Club, not with fire, but with resolve. He outlined a framework called Equity in Flight, a multi-point passenger protection system designed to reform commercial aviation from gate to landing. It was composed of 4 pillars. 1. Bias detection tech regulation, mandating transparency and oversight of all data-driven threat detection systems used by flight crews. 2. Flight crew ethics certification, requiring cultural competency training and anti-bias education to be certified through independent agencies. 3. Passenger rights dashboard, a live accessible platform showing seat assignments, reassignments, and the rationale behind them. 4. Digital accountability archives, automatically storing flight logs, crew actions, and conflict escalation points in a federal database for 5 years. But Marcus didn't stop there. With funding secured from whistleblower protections, public support donations, and his own company, SkyPulse Solutions, he launched a new nonprofit airfare. Its mission to track, score, and expose discriminatory practices across all U.S.-based airlines. Jada Holmes was appointed Chief Technology Officer. Evan Ruiz took on the role of Director of Transparency and Media Integrity. Nia Foster naturally became General Counsel. Even Colin Drake left Horizon after testifying before Congress and joined Airfare as Head of Ethics and Compliance. In parallel, Marcus quietly restructured a dormant LLC he had been sitting on for years. He named it SkyPath, a training and rehabilitation platform designed for re-educating flight crews removed from duty due to bias complaints. Not everyone supported it. Many felt the offenders didn't deserve a second chance. But Marcus insisted. Accountability doesn't mean erasure, he said during the program's announcement. It means evolution. If we want the system to change, we have to offer a path back for those willing to walk it. To the surprise of many, Ryan Kessler became the first enrollee. Stripped of his flight status and left ineligible for rehire, Ryan approached Marcus privately. Not with arrogance, but with something close to shame. I watched myself on that footage, he admitted, and I didn't like the man I saw. Marcus didn't offer comfort, but he offered structure. Ryan was assigned to weeks of coursework on civil rights history, implicit bias, and passenger rights law. He attended group sessions with former crew passengers and facilitators. And slowly the smirk vanished. In its place, there was quiet accountability. Preston Tate, facing civil liability and bankruptcy, went silent. His media consulting firm shuttered. His TikTok account was permanently suspended. But Marcus didn't pursue personal vengeance. He let the system handle him. The public no longer wanted Preston's voice. They wanted the truth. Vicki Larson filed for wrongful termination. The court dismissed it in under a week. Elaine Carver resigned in disgrace. Her severance was revoked, and after her comments surfaced in multiple public broadcasts, she vanished from the industry entirely. Roger Hensley stepped down amid pressure from shareholders. In a final interview, he said, "We underestimated what one man could do." His resignation letter never used the words race bias or apology. Marcus never responded. He didn't need to. He had built something larger than revenge. The airline industry scrambled to adapt. Within a month, Delta United and American Airlines voluntarily adopted pieces of the equity in flight framework, hoping to avoid Horizon's fate. The FAA formalized a new division for passenger rights enforcement. Congressional hearings, previously rare for aviation ethics, now ran weekly. A silent revolution had taken flight, and at the center of it, Marcus remained composed. He rejected talk show invites, declined book deals. He didn't want celebrity. He wanted legacy, and he was building it. At the newly renamed Reynolds Aviation Equity Center, formerly Horizon Tower, Marcus stood in the executive suite repurposed as a classroom. He looked out over a group of first-year airline recruits, diverse, curious, hopeful. He began the session not with rules, but with a question. What does justice feel like at 30,000 feet? They didn't answer right away, but they leaned forward. That was enough. Outside, a plane took off. Its engines roared overhead like a reminder. The sky belonged to everyone now. The shock waves of Marcus Reynolds' confrontation didn't stop at Horizon's front door. They ripped through the entire industry, tearing apart long-standing operational norms and forcing executives, union leaders, government officials, and shareholders to face a new truth. Equity was no longer optional. It was now a structural requirement with legal teeth and public vigilance to back it. Within 10 days of Horizon Flight 227's forced landing in Scranton, 7 major lawsuits had been filed, 3 by civil rights organizations, two by aviation employee unions, one class action led by Marcus himself, and another by a coalition of passengers who'd been silently removed from flights over the years without explanation. The mounting legal action wasn't just symbolic. It exposed the scale of institutional rot that had been festering beneath the surface of air travel for decades. And it wasn't just Horizon Airlines paying the price. The FAA, under congressional pressure, launched a nationwide audit of every airline's crew assessment, software de-escalation training protocols, and internal threat detection systems. Overnight, hundreds of internal documents from multiple carriers were requested under emergency compliance orders. Several airlines scrambled to suspend or upgrade their systems code for deleting logs, replacing vendors, and attempting plausible deniability. But it didn't work, because Airfare, the nonprofit Marcus had founded, already had a growing archive of those very systems. Hundreds of whistleblowers, flight attendants, operations managers, gate agents were quietly submitting confidential reports through Airfare's encrypted portal. Some sent policy manuals, others leaked meeting recordings. A few, with tears in their eyes, submitted apology letters alongside their evidence. Marcus made sure the portal didn't just accept information. It made promises. Every report would be reviewed. Every whistleblower would receive legal protection. And most importantly, every abuse of power would be preserved, not just to punish, but to prevent. The legal, financial, and operational consequences stacked up quickly. By week 2, Horizon Airlines lost 38% of its pre-booked summer travel reservations. Business partners pulled advertising. Corporate travel accounts were suspended. Several credit card loyalty partners quietly ended their promotional deals, citing ethical misalignment. Even the once coveted Horizon Sky Lounge memberships saw mass cancellations. The company's stock plummeted further, dropping from $73 a share to $11 in 17 trading days. Major hedge funds dumped their holdings. Class action filings from investors soon followed, claiming the company had failed to disclose its internal risk regarding systemic bias. In total, Horizon bled over $4.1 billion of market value within 3 weeks. And then came the resignations. The entire Horizon board, under public pressure and SEC inquiry, was dissolved and replaced with an emergency transitional council, a mix of federal appointees and industry experts. Notably, the new board included a surprising name: Colin Drake, the pilot who had quietly recorded the damning cockpit audio and shared it with regulators. His courage in breaking ranks, combined with his clean record and veteran reputation, made him the perfect symbol of internal reform. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Marcus coordinated the broader response with calculated precision. He held private Zoom calls with CEOs of other airlines, not to gloat but to advise. He walked them through the structural vulnerabilities of their systems, pointing out patterns of bias hidden in code policy loopholes that could lead to litigation and staffing practices that were ticking PR time bombs. Some listened, others resisted. But the pressure didn't let up, because Marcus had one final strategic asset: public visibility. Every week, Airfare released anonymous equity scores for domestic carriers based on whistleblower reports, public complaints, crew diversity audits, and AI-assisted bias detection from ticketing and seating data. The scores were published across Airfare's site, LinkedIn, and social media. It worked. Airlines that had once fought tooth and nail against accountability were now advertising their Airfare scores as if they were Michelin stars. But not everyone had the same fate. Vicky Larson's photo, pulled from in-flight video, had become a cautionary tale. Airline HR departments across the country began updating onboarding training materials to include her case, some even referring to it as the Larson Protocol. Her career, once ascending with seniority and experience, was over. Ryan Kessler remained in the SkyPath program, completing every required module. Though he had been named in multiple lawsuits, Marcus chose not to pursue additional charges once Ryan complied fully with legal cooperation. His statements were included in several investigations, and his testimony, now honest and remorseful, became a key piece in the government's case against Horizon's leadership. Elaine Carver, once untouchable, faced the harshest fall. After months of silence, the Department of Transportation announced she would be barred from holding any FAA-certified role indefinitely. Her pension was revoked. Her name removed from industry registries. She attempted to file a countersuit, but found no firm willing to represent her. Even the media began shifting focus from scandal to structural recovery. Primetime specials aired "The Sky Has Changed Equity" at 30,000 feet in Reynolds versus the Skies. Documentary teams approached Marcus. He declined. I'm not the story, he told them. The structure is. And indeed it was. Because this wasn't just about the fall of a company. It was about the consequences that follow when power is misused, when lies are policy, and when no one stands up until someone finally does. Marcus Reynolds didn't destroy Horizon. He held up a mirror, and the system collapsed under its own reflection. The reversal wasn't theatrical. There were no grand apologies broadcast on national television, no teary confessions from former executives. That wasn't how real power shifts. It doesn't beg. It transfers quietly, steadily, and completely. And that's exactly what Marcus Reynolds orchestrated. Once the public saw the magnitude of Horizon's failures, the question wasn't whether the airline would recover. It was whether the industry could survive its own reflection. And as the former giants scrambled to realign their image, Marcus quietly assumed a role he'd never asked for, but had clearly earned architect of aviation equity. Within 3 weeks of the Horizon collapse, Marcus had received formal requests from 4 airline CEOs, 2 airport authorities, and even the Department of Homeland Security. They wanted consultation, not on PR, on policy. They needed help rebuilding from the ground up, and the one man who had taken down a $10 billion company mid-flight had become their most valuable resource. Marcus didn't weaponize his influence. He organized it. So, at Airfare's temporary headquarters housed in a converted wing of the Reynolds Aviation Equity Center, he convened a summit of stakeholders, aviation regulators, union leaders, flight crew representatives, pilot instructors, data scientists, and civil rights attorneys. Not one executive from Horizon was invited. Their names were too toxic. Their voices no longer relevant. Instead, in the center of the room sat new power. Jada Holmes led the panel on cybersecurity and algorithmic bias. She unveiled a detailed report showing how predictive threat technology disproportionately flagged passengers of color based on behavioral cues coded into the system by developers who had never flown commercial. Colin Drake addressed ethical response protocols from the cockpit. He emphasized that pilots, often shielded from what happens behind the curtain, must now be the final layer of accountability, not just safety. Nia Foster presented a series of model contracts for passengers and flight crews, granting them mutual rights of documentation, de-escalation, and third-party mediation in real time. Evan Ruiz walked the room through a training simulation designed for media literacy, teaching crews how to recognize when escalation was being driven by optics rather than safety. It was a reversal of not just control, but of narrative. Because for decades, passengers like Marcus were told they had to trust the system, that their safety, their dignity, their rights were in the hands of trained professionals. But now those same professionals were in a training session of their own, learning how to rebuild trust they had so casually violated. And for the first time, Marcus spoke not just as a victim of injustice, but as a custodian of reform. There is no seat in the sky worth more than human dignity, he began. You don't get to choose who belongs. The law already has. The room fell still. From the corner, a former regional pilot raised her hand. What about people like us? We were part of the old system. Some of us enabled it, but we're not all villains. Marcus looked at her evenly. I don't believe in villains. I believe in systems that create them and then hide behind them. But I also believe in accountability. He paused. If you're here to change, start with silence. Listen first, then act differently. It landed like a sermon. Meanwhile, back in the public eye, the scales continued to tip. News outlets that once questioned Marcus' calm during the incited now aired glowing retrospectives. Editorials praised his quiet revolution. Universities began requesting permission to study his case in ethics courses. A handful of airlines even asked to license Airfare's passenger transparency dashboard for permanent installation. Preston Tate, now broke and shunned, released a statement via a third-party legal team attempting to apologize. It backfired. The public saw it for what it was: damage control. His face, once a smug centerpiece of viral injustice, now appeared in ad campaigns for implicit bias training, often labeled simply the passenger who pushed. Ryan Kessler remained in the SkyPath program, where he had shifted from trainee to contributor. Under Jada's mentorship, he began developing a mobile interface to let passengers report real-time interactions directly to regulators. He never spoke about the past unless asked. And when he didn't make excuses. I wasn't trained to see people, he admitted once. I was trained to see problems. Marcus made me realize I was both. But perhaps the most symbolic moment of power reversal came quietly. Roger Hensley, former Horizon CEO, was spotted arriving at a private arbitration hearing. His once pristine, tailored suits had been replaced with something far more ordinary. No driver, no entourage, no press. Inside the room sat Marcus, Naya, and a federal mediator. Roger didn't speak for several minutes. Finally, he asked, "What do you want from me?" Marcus looked him in the eye. "I don't want anything. I'm here so you can hear what happens when people you dismissed rise up. You're not powerful anymore. You're just another man facing accountability." Roger flinched. The imbalance was clear. Because Marcus didn't need to win in that room. He had already changed the world outside of it. The ripple Marcus Reynolds started on Flight 227 didn't just bring a corrupt institution to its knees. It birthed a new generation of leadership that would redefine the culture of aviation and corporate responsibility altogether. And this leadership didn't rise from legacy or nepotism. It emerged from integrity, experience, and the fire forged in systemic injustice. When the new board of Horizon Airlines was finally announced under its temporary federal stewardship, there wasn't a single old executive listed. Instead, the Department of Transportation, along with an oversight coalition from Airfare and the Civil Aviation Ethics Council, curated a transitional leadership slate that represented what Horizon had failed to for decades: the flying public. Among them was Colin Drake, now Director of Pilot Training and Safety Compliance. His responsibility to reshape the decision-making framework that had once allowed crews to profile passengers under vague terms like disruptive or suspicious. Under his guidance, those terms were stripped of subjectivity and redefined based on evidence, not emotion. Next was Jada Holmes, officially brought on as Chief Technology Officer. Her first act was to decommission Horizon's in-house threat algorithm, a system that had flagged Marcus as dangerous based on behavioral heuristics rooted in racial and socioeconomic biases. In its place, Jada deployed a new AI oversight system that was fully auditable by third-party ethics teams. No more black box decisions. No more code without conscience. The role of Chief Legal and Compliance Officer went fittingly to Nia Foster. She crafted Horizon's new Passenger Bill of Dignity, a binding internal document that was to be printed on every boarding pass and taught in every training session. It spelled out in plain terms that no passenger could be profiled based on appearance, language, posture, attire, or perceived status. Violations weren't just HR issues, they were grounds for immediate investigation and potential prosecution. Meanwhile, Evan Ruiz declined an executive title, but accepted a newly created position as Director of Public Oversight and Transparency. His job was to ensure the public's eyes remained on Horizon. He helped install live complaint dashboards in every terminal where anonymous feedback could be submitted in real time and automatically logged in an immutable archive. If someone was mistreated, crew staff or passenger, it would be seen. And then there was Marcus. He refused the title of CEO. "I'm not here to manage a company," he told reporters. "I'm here to change the conditions that made it dangerous." But he did accept a ceremonial title, Chairman Emeritus of the Horizon Reform Council. It wasn't about control, it was about direction. He attended meetings, reviewed quarterly reforms, and occasionally led new hire sessions, where he shared one principle: leadership is not about who speaks the loudest. It's about who listens the longest and acts the clearest. The new hires listened. The reforms once scoffed at by industry insiders began to prove themselves in data. Within 6 months of implementation, customer complaints dropped by 46%. In-flight escalations dropped by 72%. Crew member retention rose by 34%. And for the first time in company history, Horizon achieved a 100% conflict resolution training rate across all staff. The FAA cited Horizon as the most improved aviation organization in a decade. And the public began to return, slowly at first, then steadily, not because of slick ads, but because of trust. Other airlines, seeing Horizon's rebirth, followed suit. Delta launched a new ethics board. United restructured their in-flight incident reporting protocol. American partnered with Airfare to integrate live equity scores into their seat booking interfaces. A cultural shift was in motion, and at its core were the leaders Marcus had quietly empowered. But leadership didn't just change in the boardrooms, it changed in the sky. At the newly rebranded Reynolds Flight Academy, Dozens of former crew members, many previously suspended or removed, enrolled in retraining programs. They weren't there to salvage careers. They were there to start over, to do the hard work, to unlearn. Some of them had cried in those classes. I thought I was helping, one former attendant admitted. I thought protecting other passengers meant removing the ones who made me nervous. But I never asked why they made me nervous. Leadership didn't scold her. It gave her space to reckon. And that reckoning created something stronger than compliance empathy. By year's end, the FAA approved a policy initiative co-authored by Marcus and Naya, the passenger equity mandate, requiring all commercial U.S. carriers to implement real-time bias monitoring, third-party incident review, and an independent audit board for passenger disputes. The mandate passed with bipartisan support. The industry would never operate the same, and for Marcus that was enough. He still flew coach sometimes, not out of humility, but out of curiosity, to watch, to see the systems in motion, to ensure the changes were more than symbolic. He'd board with his rolling briefcase, nod politely to staff, and settle in near the window, observing the boarding process with quiet precision, watching how passengers were treated, listening to the way authority was used. One afternoon, as he sat in 17A on a Horizon flight from D.C. to Denver, a young flight attendant leaned in and whispered, "We've studied you, Mr. Reynolds, in training." Marcus smiled. "What did you learn?" The young man paused, then replied that leadership starts before takeoff. Yes, Marcus thought. Yes, it does. What Marcus Reynolds and his team initiated wasn't just a shift in perception. It was a complete institutional overhaul, the kind that rewired the mechanics of how power policy and people interacted inside the aviation world. The headlines had faded, the viral hashtags slowed, but within the corridors of influence, something permanent had taken hold. Reform became the new standard. Airfare, once an ad hoc response group, matured into the most trusted third-party compliance authority in the industry. Airlines that refused to work with them found themselves penalized not by government mandates at first, but by customer attrition. Passengers had begun checking airfare's trust ratings the same way they checked flight delays or baggage fees. A carrier's rating wasn't just a badge of honor, it was a lifeline. To meet this demand, Marcus worked with Jada and Naya to establish a national certification process, the Airfare Accreditation for Ethical Flight Operations, AEFO. This certification became the gold standard for commercial aviation ethics. To receive it, airlines had to meet strict criteria: implementation of real-time passenger equity dashboards, annual third-party crew audit reviews, bias flag detection built into crew reporting tools, verified anonymous channels for staff and customer complaints, commitment to transparency, no sealed settlements involving discrimination. Within 6 months, only 2 airlines had achieved full certification. Horizon was one of them, but it wasn't enough to change aviation. Marcus wanted to target the root, the training institutions. He visited flight academies across the country, giving talks not just to inspire, but to challenge. He walked into classrooms of fresh-eyed future crew members and laid out the story of Flight 227 not as a tragedy, but as a blueprint. You will face pressure, he told them, not always from passengers, sometimes from supervisors, from company policy, from silence. That's where ethics matter most when no one's watching. The impact was immediate. One school in Atlanta overhauled its curriculum to include a full semester on aviation equity. A flight school in Arizona launched the first ever simulation lab, where students practiced de-escalation in scenarios involving race class and age-based profiling. And Horizon itself, under new leadership, turned its training hub into a public ethics learning center, open to crew customers and regulators alike. They called it the runway to redemption. Meanwhile, SkyPath, the retraining arm created by Marcus, evolved beyond just education. It became a second chance pipeline. Hundreds of former staff suspended or terminated under discrimination-related complaints entered the program voluntarily. They studied case law, attended restorative justice circles. They even met with passengers who had filed complaints against them. Some broke down, some walked away. But many completed the program and re-entered the industry, not just as better professionals, but as advocates. Ryan Kessler was now one of SkyPath's most requested peer facilitators. His testimony wasn't polished. It was raw. I looked at Marcus that day and thought he didn't belong. I was wrong, and I'm here because he didn't throw me away. He made me face it. That's leadership. His words were later included in the FAA's annual equity training video mandatory viewing for all new hires. At the federal level, things changed too. The Department of Transportation passed the Passenger Equity Protection Act, which made it mandatory for all U.S. airlines to report quarterly data on passenger removals and the documented reasons, disparities in upgrade seating and gate change decisions, in-flight escalation events involving passengers over age 50 or from minority groups. Marcus didn't stop there. He convened with lawmakers on the Hill to push for the Skywatchers bill, a bipartisan proposal requiring body cams on all in-flight supervisors and gate agents with automatic uploads to a federal oversight archive. The proposal met resistance at first mostly from airline lobbyists who feared exposure, but they were outmatched. The public backed it. Pilots backed it. Even insurance companies began adjusting risk assessments based on whether a carrier had Skywatchers protocols in place. The bill passed. The skies got quieter not from suppression, but from reform. Back at Airfare HQ, now fully staffed and funded through private partnerships and federal grants, Jada Holmes monitored a digital dashboard labeled Bias Interruption Events, National Trendline. The curve was heading down. Fewer removals, fewer complaints, more internal resolutions. The numbers didn't lie, but Marcus never let the team rest on data alone. Statistics comfort systems, he reminded them. Stories change them. So every month, Airfare released a report, not just with graphs, but with stories. Anonymous accounts from passengers whose dignity was preserved, whose rights were respected, whose flights were uneventful in all the right ways. These reports became national reading material for HR departments, flight academies, and ethics panels. Marcus had turned a story of humiliation into a movement of elevation. And perhaps the most unexpected piece of the reform came from international carriers. Airlines from Canada, Germany, South Africa, and Japan contacted Airfare requesting help in adopting the certification process. Marcus assigned small regional teams to each one, ensuring that the spirit of the reform, compassion, dignity, and structure wasn't lost in translation. One by one, the dominoes fell. The FAA, the airlines, the training schools, the regulators, the airports. And all of it began with a man sitting in seat 2A, silent, steady, recorded. Not to shame, to build. Because reform, Marcus always said, is the most powerful form of revenge. For decades, the public had accepted discomfort in the skies as normal. Delays, rude service, mysterious seat reassignments, and whispered humiliations had become part of the unspoken price of air travel. But what Flight 227 ignited beyond lawsuits and corporate collapse was a profound awakening in the people who had once remained silent. The passengers, the watchers, the bystanders, the overlooked. They were watching now, and they were speaking. In airports across the country, terminals began to change, not by design, but by presence. At JFK, a grandmother in a navy pantsuit quietly asked a gate agent why a younger black woman had been pulled aside during boarding. At LAX, a white businessman stood between a flight attendant and a Sikh passenger being questioned over his turban, holding his phone aloft. In Atlanta, an entire boarding group refused to enter the plane until a young Latina woman, falsely marked as standby, was reseated in her original first-class seat. The incidents, once met with indifference or shrugs, were now confronted with conviction. Not violence, not chaos, just people saying no more. Airfare's public portal, which allowed passengers to report discrimination or unfair treatment in real time, logged over 11,000 entries in its first month. Not all were severe, many were microaggressions. But what made the system work was that every story was seen. Marcus made sure of it. He read them, he annotated them, and then he shared them with permission, with policymakers, training centers, even news outlets. One report read, "I was asked if I was lost because I was sitting in first class. I'm not lost. I'm a partner at a law firm. I didn't say anything that day. But after Flight 227, I submitted this, because now I know I'm not crazy." Another, "My father is 72. He speaks softly and dresses plainly. He was told to show ID twice when others weren't. I didn't know how to report it before. Now I do." And another, "A flight attendant rolled her eyes at my hijab. That used to ruin my trip. Now I submit it and I get a reply." That alone changed everything. The system wasn't perfect. Marcus never claimed it was. But it existed. And that changed the rules. News outlets that had once sensationalized airline confrontations now shifted their tone. Investigative journalism flourished. NBC ran a five-part series titled Seat 2A: What Changed the Skies. NPR hosted passenger panels where survivors of flight discrimination shared their voices without being cut off or corrected. But the most stunning change came not from policy, but from poetry. Yes, poetry. An 11-year-old girl named Camille from Detroit wrote a spoken word piece titled Boarding Pass, which she performed at her middle school's assembly. It went viral. I am not your threat. I am not your fear. I am not the reason your silence clears. I am a traveler just like you, with a story, with a seat, with a view. Marcus saw it. He cried. He invited Camille and her parents to the Reynolds Aviation Equity Center, where she stood in front of regulators and corporate leaders and read the poem again. She received a standing ovation. That same week, a lawmaker read it into the congressional record. Because this was no longer about Marcus. It was about the people who had watched him be erased and decided they'd never let it happen again. Passenger unions formed independent organizations built not to litigate, but to educate and mobilize. They held events, taught travelers their rights, distributed wallet-sized cards with FAA and airfare contact info. Even children began to speak up. One day, a 9-year-old boy on a flight from Houston to Chicago saw a flight attendant bypass an elderly black couple in the drink cart rotation. He raised his hand. "You skip them," he said clearly. The attendant, startled, paused. She returned and served them. The couple smiled. When the boy's mother asked why he spoke up, he said Marcus wouldn't let people be treated that way. That name, Marcus, had entered the lexicon. Not as a symbol of anger, but as a benchmark for dignity. Church groups referenced his story in sermons. High school civics classes included his case study under civil rights discussions. A Harvard law professor redesigned an ethics seminar around Flight 2D7 with the syllabus title When Policy Meets Prejudice. And in public opinion, polls' confidence in airlines that embraced airfare certification was higher than those that hadn't yet. But perhaps the clearest sign of the awakening came in a quiet corner of O'Hare Airport. A man in his 50s sat in a wheelchair at the gate waiting to board. The gate agent looked down at him, smiled, and said, "You're Marcus, right?" The man shook his head. "No," he replied, "but I'm flying because of him." The agent nodded and offered his hand. "Then welcome back to the skies," because the skies had changed, and the people in them had too. The transformation Marcus Reynolds had set in motion didn't stop with the American aviation industry. Like a sonic boom echoing across continents, the impact of Flight 227's legacy reached airports, boardrooms, and parliaments around the world. Airlines in Europe, Asia, Africa, and South America began reevaluating not just their policies but their philosophies. It started with a ripple in Canada. Maple Sky, Canada's second-largest airline, quietly reached out to airfare requesting consultation. Their request was modest. They wanted to review their customer engagement matrix to ensure compliance with new international equity standards. But when Jada and her team reviewed their systems, they found alarming similarities to Horizon's buried profiling algorithms. Within weeks, Maple Sky released a public statement. "We have reviewed our systems and they failed our passengers. We apologize. We will do better." That last line sparked a wave. Across the Atlantic, a Dutch carrier known for its prestige and gold service sent its ethics officer to the Reynolds Aviation Equity Center for training. A Nigerian airline requested a licensing agreement for the SkyPath curriculum. In Tokyo, a business-class passenger who had been wrongly flagged for boarding irregularities quoted Marcus Reynolds' congressional testimony in her formal complaint and won a settlement. The echoes kept spreading. In London, a member of parliament introduced a motion called the Passenger Equity and Dignity Act, citing Horizon Airlines by name. In Johannesburg Airport, security staff underwent the first of a series of anti-profiling workshops designed using materials translated from Marcus's SkyPath and airfare programs. Australia's Civil Aviation Safety Authority released an industry-wide directive requiring all carriers to develop third-party reporting channels by year's end. The revolution wasn't uniquely American anymore. It was airborne. And Marcus, he had become something few corporate reformers ever managed to become: transnationally credible. Not because of fame, but because his model worked. It wasn't theoretical. It was tested. On a plane. At altitude. Under pressure. One morning, as Marcus sipped his coffee in a quiet conference room at the Equity Center, Jada burst in with an urgent email. The United Nations International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, had extended an invitation. They wanted Marcus to address the assembly, a body of representatives from 193 nations. At first, he hesitated. "I'm not a diplomat," he said. "You're the most qualified person in the world to talk about what happens when planes become battlegrounds," Jada replied. He accepted. The speech was broadcast globally. Standing before a mosaic of flags and faces, Marcus didn't quote statutes or flood the room with legalese. He told the story of Flight 227, not just the humiliation, but the silence. The silence of passengers, the silence of systems, the silence of institutions. And then he said planes are neutral objects. It's people and the power they carry who define the altitude of justice. If you create systems that profile, suppress, or erase, don't be surprised when the cabin fills with turbulence. The hall stood in ovation. From that moment, a new standard began taking shape. A proposed amendment to ICAO's Global Aviation Safety Guidelines called the Reynolds Clause, which would require all participating countries to develop non-discrimination benchmarks tied to licensing requirements, establish international protocols for cross-border complaints of profiling, mandate periodic audits of airlines' passenger interaction data. It wasn't passed overnight. There were countries that resisted. Some said it was overreach. Others said it would be too costly. But the pressure from citizens, activists, and civil aviation groups began to mount. Meanwhile, airlines that embraced the changes didn't just survive. They flourished. Customer loyalty soared. Employee retention increased. Lawsuits dropped. One airline in Chile reported a 78% reduction in passenger conflict incidents after implementing the SkyPath retraining curriculum. Another in Morocco reported a 31% increase in positive passenger feedback after installing the airfare transparency dashboard at its check-in counters. And Horizon, it didn't just recover, it redefined itself. Now branded as Horizon Equity Airways, the company became the first airline in the world to offer a bias-free guarantee, a formal policy stating that any confirmed instance of discrimination would result in a passenger's full refund, staff review, and a public apology. They even created a legacy program, the 2A Fellowship, a scholarship for underrepresented students in aviation law, tech, and ethics. Marcus approved the name. He didn't attend the press launch. He didn't want to take the spotlight. Instead, he visited a quiet airport in North Dakota where a former flight attendant named Cheryl, who had once enforced harmful policies, unknowingly now taught new hires how to challenge them. "I heard your speech," she said, "and I thought, maybe this time I could help build something instead of enforce something broken." He nodded. That was the point. Back in D.C., members of Congress referenced the Reynolds model during budget hearings. In Geneva, ICAO continued refining the global resolution. And in airport bookstores from Amsterdam to Jakarta, a small paperback appeared on shelves. Skyward Justice, the Marcus Reynolds story, written not by Marcus, but by an anonymous group of contributors, journalists, passengers, and crew who had witnessed the change firsthand. Inside the front cover was a simple dedication to everyone who stayed seated when injustice happened. Now you know. Next time stand. Because Marcus hadn't changed the industry alone. The world had listened. And now it was answering back. The reforms had reshaped the skies. The leadership had changed. The global aviation community had echoed with new values. But beneath it all, beneath the new manuals, the policies, the speeches, one final truth remained buried. Until now. It was Jada Holmes who discovered it. Working late in Airfare's secure digital vault, she was combing through server logs submitted anonymously by a whistleblower, a former Horizon cybersecurity engineer who had fled quietly after the Flight 227 scandal broke. Most of the data had already been integrated into the class action proceedings. But one zipped file caught her attention. It was labeled Canopy Project, Internal Only. Jada decrypted the file and watched her eyes narrowing as lines of code gave way to video snippets, biometric charts, and risk assessment dashboards. This wasn't just the old flagging system. This was something far worse. Canopy was a covert passenger surveillance program. Unlike the previously exposed profiling protocols that flagged travelers based on seating behavior or travel patterns, Canopy went further. It used biometric markers, facial tension, eye movement, speech cadence to assign passengers a risk quotient within minutes of check-in. The system operated without disclosure, without consent, without oversight. Worse, it stored data indefinitely, even for passengers never involved in any incident. And among the tag profiles, Marcus Reynolds. 3 years before Flight 227, his biometric signature had been silently flagged during a routine flight to Atlanta. No incident had occurred. No notes had been made, but the system had labeled him as high alert, assertive demeanor. The tag was never removed. From that point forward, Marcus was shadow flagged on every flight booked with Horizon. His confrontation in 2A wasn't just about race. It was about data. A machine had decided who he was long before a human ever looked him in the eye. Jada's hands trembled. She contacted Naya, who confirmed this discovery changed everything. Not just the civil suit, not just public perception. This was likely a violation of international surveillance law. They looped in Marcus. He read the report in silence. This was never about one incident, he said quietly. It was a sentence I never knew was passed. That afternoon, Marcus stood in front of reporters at a surprise press briefing. There were no announcements, no pre-scheduled media alerts, just a simple post: final proof has been found. Join me at 3 p.m., Airfare HQ. By 2:58, the room was full. Cameras, phones, microphones, quiet anticipation. At exactly 3:00, Marcus stepped to the podium and dropped a flash drive into a clear glass bowl labeled evidence. This, he said, is Canopy. He explained the program, the biometric scanning, the unauthorized data collection, the shadow flagging. He detailed how the system had followed passengers across years, logged their faces, and ranked their personalities using pseudoscience and AI guesswork. He told them he had been tagged not for his race alone, but for his confidence. And then he paused. I wasn't profiled by accident. I was profiled by design. The room fell into stunned silence. Reporters typed feverishly. Some of them already knew what this meant: potential criminal charges, a broader international scandal, a challenge to how surveillance was implemented, not just in aviation, but across travel security and corporate behavior globally. Within minutes, the hashtag #CanopyExposed began trending. Marcus concluded with one sentence: "You cannot reform what you still hide." That night, 3 major news outlets broke the Canopy story across primetime. CNN ran with the headline, "Beyond Bias, the Hidden Algorithms That Still Govern Our Skies." ProPublica published a detailed data analysis. The New York Times released an interactive profile showing the leaked system's visual dashboard and a sample of the passenger behavior risk scores. The backlash was immediate. Airlines previously celebrated for transparency now faced questions. How many used similar systems? How many travelers had been tracked without consent? The FAA announced an emergency summit. The ACLU filed a motion demanding the DOJ launch a federal criminal inquiry into Canopy's legality. And the biggest blow, the United Nations Human Rights Council scheduled a special session on biometric surveillance in civilian travel, naming Horizon and the Canopy program specifically. Back at Airfare, Marcus stood with Jada and Naya watching the world react. He didn't gloat, he didn't smirk, but he finally exhaled. This, he whispered, was the part they never thought we'd find. Nia nodded. Now that we have, it's no longer a program. It's a precedent, Jada added. In the following days, the Canopy program's exposure led to the emergency injunctions on biometric surveillance at 3 major airports, suspension of several international data-sharing partnerships, congressional drafting of the Reynolds Biometric Integrity Act. The bill, still in early form, aimed to regulate all biometric systems used by airlines, airports, and travel companies, requiring consent audit logs and the right to erasure. The consequences rippled beyond aviation. Ride-sharing apps, hotel chains, car rental agencies, all of them began issuing transparency statements. What began in Seat 2A had now reached every corner of the travel ecosystem. Marcus never said, "I told you so." He simply offered a phrase to every executive regulator and technologist who called him afterward in disbelief: "The skies aren't yours, they never were. You were just stewards. The people are the owners, and we've come to collect." The cameras began to fade. The hashtags slowed their climb. The headlines moved on to other scandals, other storms. But behind the noise and beyond the lights, the true victory of Marcus Reynolds unfolded not in front of a cheering crowd, but in moments so small, so human, They almost went unnoticed. That's how Marcus preferred it. He had never wanted to be a symbol. He wanted to be a man treated with dignity. And now, finally, after the chaos, the reform, the exposure, that dignity was no longer a request. It was the standard. On a foggy morning in late October, Marcus boarded a commercial flight from D.C. to Seattle. No fanfare, no entourage. Just a Navy coat, his ever-present briefcase, and a boarding pass marked 2A. The same seat, the same position. A world away from the turbulence that once defined it. He moved through TSA with quiet ease. No extra screening, no searching glances, no questions about his ID. As he stepped into the aircraft, a young black flight attendant greeted him. Her smile was warm but not performative. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Reynolds," she said, recognizing the name but not forcing the weight of it. "Let me know if you need anything." He nodded. "Thank you. I'm just here to fly." And he was. Across the aisle, no one shifted uncomfortably. No one reached for a phone. The cabin was calm. People were reading, settling in, sipping coffee. In an industry where fear and bias once dictated behavior, the absence of tension was itself revolutionary. Marcus sat down, adjusted his seatbelt, and looked out the window as the engines began to hum. For the first time in years, he felt like a passenger. Not a case study, not a legal risk, not a threat, just a man on his way home. Back on the ground, Airfare continued its work. The organization had grown from a temporary crisis team into a permanent global authority. It operated in 14 countries, now offering training, policy guidance, and independent auditing. SkyPath, its sister organization, had trained over 3,000 aviation professionals, including 800 former staff who had been disciplined for past discriminatory behavior. Many of them now served as advocates, mentors, and instructors. Ryan Kessler, once the smug flight attendant who flagged Marcus as a threat, now worked as SkyPath's Director of Internal Culture Reform. He no longer used words like rebranding or rehabilitation. He spoke instead about redemption, and about how sometimes the quietest voices are the ones that echo the longest. "I don't live with guilt," Ryan said during a panel. "I live with responsibility." That's the difference, Marcus taught me. In a law school in Boston, a professor held up the Horizon Airlines case as a blueprint for systemic change through civil channels. In a public policy lecture in Johannesburg, the airfare equity dashboard was dissected as a model for transparent governance. In a small town in Kentucky, a teenager wrote an essay titled, "I Want to Be Marcus Reynolds When I Grow Up." Marcus read it. He replied with a handwritten note, "Don't be me. Be better." That's the point of all this. At the Reynolds Aviation Equity Center, a new wing was under construction. It would house a permanent exhibit called Seat 2A, a multimedia display featuring recorded passenger stories from all over the world. Stories of silence, of survival, of awakening. But more importantly, stories of change. The final exhibit would be an empty seat. No plaque, no rope, just a seat, so people could sit, reflect, and remember. Not the injustice, but the endurance. One afternoon, as Marcus walked the perimeter of the new wing, he passed a woman sitting in that very seat, head bowed, tears in her eyes. He paused. "Are you all right?" She looked up, startled. "I'm sorry," she said, brushing her cheek. "I didn't expect to feel this much. I was removed from a flight years ago. I never spoke about it. Until this place, until your story." Marcus nodded. "You're not alone anymore." She smiled through her tears. "I know, that's why I'm crying." And then she asked, "What does it feel like to win?" He looked out at the terminal. People moved freely, families, elders, students, workers, all different, all flying. He thought of the cabin where he sat alone and silent. He thought of the cameras, the lawsuits, the policies, the backlash. He thought of the justice that roared like thunder, and the dignity that followed in its stillness. "It feels quiet," he said, "but solid, like gravity. It's always been there. We just had to claim it." She stood, took his hand, and whispered, "Thank you." Marcus said nothing. He just nodded and walked on. Because victory, real victory, isn't applause. It's not a trophy. It's walking into a space where you were once erased and being seen. Fully, finally, freely. In the months following the exposure of Canopy and the quiet triumph of Flight 227's aftermath, something remarkable happened, not just in airports or courtrooms, but in the very architecture of how justice was remembered. Marcus Reynolds' legacy had already reshaped policies, reformed industries, and redefined global standards for dignity in flight. But now it began to do something more difficult. It began to last. The permanence of his work wasn't in stone or bronze. It was in systems. It was in how organizations began to carry themselves not for show, but because transformation had taken root deeper than compliance. At the heart of that legacy stood the Reynolds Aviation Equity Center, which had grown beyond a think tank. It had become a living institution, a place where new leaders in aviation ethics were mentored, where whistleblowers were protected, and where survivors of systemic injustice were offered support not just legal or logistical, but emotional. Healing was part of the model. Visitors came from across the world. Pilots from Kenya, union reps from Seoul, ministers of transport from Berlin. They sat in the glass-walled classrooms beneath framed stills of body cam footage from Flight 227, and they didn't just study what went wrong. They studied what was possible when someone refused to be erased. In the central atrium stood a sculpture, simple, understated. It was a curved arc of polished steel, 6 feet tall, inscribed with only one phrase: "Dignity takes flight when silence is no longer an option." Marcus never spoke at the unveiling. He didn't need to. He stood at the back, hands folded, while Nia Foster gave the keynote. He never wanted this, Nia said, gesturing toward the building, the crowd, the cameras. He wanted change. And when no one else stood, he stayed seated, until the whole world stood with him. Applause rose. Some wept. Others simply nodded, silently grateful. But legacy isn't just what's built. It's what's remembered. And Marcus's story became the memory that moved. In textbooks around the world, case study Reynolds Vermont. Horizon Airlines was added to law curriculums, ethics syllabi, and tech policy debates. In public schools, Marcus's image wasn't one of defiance. It was one of composure, of strategy, of moral clarity under fire. The Reynolds Clause, ratified by the International Civil Aviation Organization, became a foundational requirement for global carriers, mandating full transparency in data-driven passenger screening and the guaranteed right to access and challenge risk scores. The Passenger Equity Protection Act, now law in the U.S., established a federal database where passengers could log incidents and track investigations. No more secrets, no more sealed settlements. Airfare under JATA Homes expanded into maritime and rail industries, applying the same principles of dignity, equity, and transparency to other travel sectors. The idea was clear: if you move people, you owe them respect. SkyPath launched sister campuses in Brazil, South Africa, and Singapore. And Marcus. He remained where he always belonged, just behind the scenes, guiding the work, never seeking the spotlight. In one of his final public appearances, Marcus stood at a private ceremony where a new aviation training school opened its gates in Newark. It was named the Marcus Reynolds Institute for Ethical Leadership in Flight. As he addressed the first graduating class, he didn't speak about what had been done to him. He spoke about what they would do. "You are inheriting skies once ruled by indifference," he said. "You have a chance to make them different. Not perfect, but honest. Fly that way." The speech was recorded, archived, and translated into 27 languages. Today, it's still played in many flight academies during orientation. But legacy for Marcus wasn't measured by what was taught. It was measured by what people no longer tolerated. No one dared say passenger flagged without cause anymore. No airline risked reshuffling first-class seating without documentation. No employee laughed off a complaint as sensitivity, because the world remembered. The memory was a firewall. The policies were its code. And the people who once looked away, they now looked out for each other. At a quiet memorial held on the 5th anniversary of the flight, a young girl approached Marcus's daughter, Mia Reynolds, who had continued her father's work in private law. The girl had once been profiled as a child during travel and had grown up watching her father talk about Marcus with reverence. She held out a drawing. It showed a man in a suit seated in 2A with light streaming down over him while shadows reached toward him from behind. The words written on the seat: "Reserved for those who won't move when it matters." Mia framed it and hung it inside the Equity Center. It rests today in the main hallway beside the list of global reforms inspired by Marcus Reynolds' name. And every day people pass it, travelers, workers, students, and they remember he wasn't a politician. He wasn't a billionaire. He wasn't seeking fame. He was a man who sat where he belonged and didn't move until the world did. The sun rose slowly over the runways of what was once Horizon International Airport. Now its name had changed. The signage read Reynolds Aviation Equity Terminal, an architectural beacon of light glass and open design, symbolizing the transparency the industry once lacked. Travelers walked beneath the soaring arc of steel and sunlight, greeted not by security, barking orders, but by staff trained to see, listen, and respect. And somewhere in the bustle, Marcus Reynolds watched quietly from a second-floor overlook. He no longer wore the tailored suits that had once been his armor. Today, in soft charcoal wool and a coat more suited to walking than war, he looked like any other traveler. Except he wasn't. Not anymore. He was the architect of a movement. Not through ambition, but necessity. It began in a seat he paid for, a seat they tried to deny him, a seat that became a symbol not of status, but of standing firm. Seat 2A. But this story, his story, was never about a seat. It was about who was seen and who was erased. Marcus had seen what most would have overlooked: how technology's silence and unchecked bias had fused into something systemic. He'd been shoved, profiled, falsely labeled, and humiliated, not just by a person, but by an institution that had perfected the art of dehumanization behind policy and procedure. And he never raised his voice. He raised the bar. Now, 5 years later, the results spoke louder than the injustice ever had. Over 70% of U.S. airlines were airfare certified. The passenger equity dashboard became a standard display on in-flight monitors. SkyPath had trained over 5,000 crew members globally, including former offenders who had turned into advocates. But the true proof of change wasn't on paper. It was in the mother boarding with her autistic son and receiving help instead of stares. It was in the elderly Black veteran who no longer had to explain why he was sitting in business class. It was in the immigrant grandfather traveling alone who wasn't pulled aside for verification. It was in the quiet shared understanding that everyone deserved to belong. Marcus passed through the terminal unnoticed, and he liked it that way. At Gate 19, a group of new hires in blue uniforms huddled around a training tablet. On the screen was a simulation of Flight 227. They watched Vicky Larson's mistake, Ryan Kessler's abuse of the system, and Preston Tate's cruelty. None of them spoke during the video, but when it ended, one trainee asked, "Would we have stopped it?" The instructor, a former SkyPath graduate, smiled and replied, "Now you would." Across the concourse, a 12-year-old girl read aloud from a library kiosk installed by Airfare. Her voice rang clear as she recited part of Camille's now famous poem, "I am not your threat, I am not your fear, I am the voice you refuse to hear." Her father placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "That poem made laws change, sweetheart." She nodded, proud. Elsewhere, on a long-haul flight from Paris to D.C., a young South Asian man pressed the call button after overhearing another passenger mutter a racial slur toward a stewardess. The crew didn't hesitate. The offending passenger was moved. An apology was issued publicly. No shouting, no escalation. Just policy working like it should have always worked. That was Marcus's legacy, not drama, but design. Not victory through force, but through reform. The Supreme Court, in a 6-3 ruling on biometric consent in transportation, quoted Marcus' final testimony, "If flight is the triumph of physics over gravity, then equity is the triumph of dignity over indifference." His words were etched into the side of the new FAA headquarters. And yet he stayed silent through most of it. He refused interviews, declined honorary doctorates, turned down political offers. He said he'd already made his impact where it mattered, at altitude. Still, every so often, he received letters. One came from an 82-year-old retired pilot. "I flew for 30 years and never once questioned why my crews looked the way they did, why our passengers were sorted the way they were. You woke me up, Mr. Reynolds. I only wish I'd woken up sooner." Another came from a little boy who had been removed from a flight due to too much energy. "Thank you for fixing the airplanes. Now they don't say I'm a problem anymore." And still another came from Vicky Larson. "No excuses, no pleading, just a sentence: 'Thank you for building a system that finally taught me what I failed to see.'" Marcus never replied. He didn't need to. The system was working. The skies, once heavy with hidden weight, now lifted people without bias. And as Marcus boarded one final flight to nowhere in particular, no press, no lawsuit, no policy in tow, he passed the cockpit, looked to the right, and nodded to the young Black female pilot preparing for takeoff. She nodded back. No words exchanged, just a look, a thank you. a quiet understanding that the path had been cleared, not for one man, but for all of us. If you found this story powerful, subscribe to Real Life Stories New for more narratives that expose injustice and celebrate quiet revolutions.